Yeah, we're live, 7:12. Today we're talking about big ports and more importantly the relationship between the port size and torque production. Because here's one of the things that people assume are absolutes. So I get comments from all the time about this, and there is, the problem is that when people make comments like this, there is some merit to it. There is a what I call an internet level of logic behind it and kind of understanding, because on the surface it makes sense. So the discussion is, when you have your cylinder heads and you have small ports, do the small ports make more torque? Because air velocity, I get the velocity up, cylinder filling and air velocity and all the buzzwords or whatever. And so you should, you get the airspeed up and it should better cylinder filling, and so it should make more torque. Here's what I want to ask about that. Is the velocity up in the port because it's restrictive? Because it's having to draw? And then do you have, other reflected waves and all sorts of things going on? Because we'll reserve our discussion tonight for basically port size. Because I've done a couple of tests. One, I'm showing the port in a comparison that I did on a 363-inch small block Ford. I also did this similar test, ported versus unported versions of heads, on a 347 stroker. And I think I also did it on a 302 in the Ford stuff. I've also done it on LS stuff. But the question is, you get the small ports and they make more torque. Like, for instance, in the LS world, people would say, well, the cathedral port, which is, I guess, smaller in port volume than a rec port head, the cathedral port head makes more torque. Does it? Does it really? So first, we'll on the LS side, no, it doesn't, because I tested stock LS7 or stock LS3 heads. These were LY6, but it's the same head, just without the lighter valve in it. The stock LS head, the LY6 head, the stock rec port head versus a stock 799/243 head. Tested them both on a cam 6-liter. And while we would want the cathedral port head to make more torque, it did not. The rec port head had the highest peak torque of the two. Only because it's making peak torque on a cam 6-liter, probably in an RPM range where it's still starting to favor the bigger head, because the bigger head did make more power. It flows a lot more. It flows 240 or 50 CFM versus 315 CFM. So it flows a lot more. Yeah, the port's bigger, but it also flows a lot more air. So it makes more power and it makes more torque. So in the conversation of, does a rec port head, cathedral port head, make more torque than a rec port head, the answer in that test is no. But does that mean that's an absolute thing? And also, and we're going to talk about the Ford thing in just a second, but also in that instance, the cathedral port head makes more torque down low, but did not make more peak torque. So what is your question? Is your question, does it make more torque at 3,000? Does it make more torque down low in the range where we would be towing stuff or whatever, where you might be using it more often than above 5,000? If that's your question, then that needs to be your question. So, and same thing on the 302 application. This was a 363, so a short deck stroker version with a 425 bore and a 3400 stroke. This was a Dart SHP block. And so the comparison is we ran a set of 175 Dart as cast heads, small ports, and then a set of 210 full CNC Dart, I guess, Pro 1 heads, because I wanted to do this comparison of port volume and also to find out where the ported head would, where it would shine compared to the other stuff. And I ran this test on a 302, and then also we ran on a 347, and I also ran just a singular test on this 363, I think. If maybe it was the other way around on the 347. I think we ran all four of them on the 363. So we ran the port volume test, and we have, we have the change in power and we have the change in port volume. And so we could kind of, we could kind of corroborate those two or correlate those two. This was so to end the suspense anyway, when comparing a 210 CNC head and a 170 ass cast head on this 363, which had a pretty good sized cam, and I mean, this thing made 565 horsepower, so it did pretty well. But the bigger head made more peak torque. The smaller head did not make more peak torque. The smaller head, in fact, only made more torque in a very narrow range, and not even at the bottom of the RPM range where you would think it would. It made more torque from 4,100 to 47 or 4,800. It's just in this narrow range. And below that, the bigger head did better. So, and then the bigger head did a lot better out on the top. The power picked up from I don't know, 510 or 515 or something up to 565. So the bigger flowing head, the 210 CNC head, was way better than the ASCAST head and offered a lot more power, especially above 5,000. But even below 40 or 3,800, it was a little bit better. Although you wouldn't, we're talking about onesies and twosies down there. And a lot, like 50 out on the big end. So you definitely notice the change in power from that. But the interesting thing is, were you to ask, does it? So in fact, we'll do that. We'll do that right now and see. Does a smaller head port make more torque? Well, let's ask the people. Let's ask the people what they think. So these are two instances, and we've also done this I've done this many times on big blocks where we've had different size port volumes. And I don't know that I've yet seen, the one exception might be the little 265 airflow research head on the big blocks. I'd like to compare that to some other stuff and see, because it has a small port volume, but the other thing that it has going for it that some of these heads don't have is that it also has like ample cylinder head or ample flow. So it's enough cylinder head to support a lot of power for a lot of applications. And so having the smaller port volume might benefit it there. But that's really our discussion. That should be our discussion. It shouldn't be an absolute thing. Is that like this is always comes up with the 4V, 2V port size on the Cleveland stuff. Oh, 2V is definitely the way to go. It's going to be smaller, much more torque. Now, I would venture to guess that if you ran a 2V head and a 4V head with similar intakes, because they can't be the same, maybe you could run Edelbrocks on both of them, and then it would be small for the 4V and only slightly small for the 2V. But if you could do that, my money would still be on the 4-valve head. It flows a lot more than a 2V head does. It would be like the Ford thing that we're talking about, where one of them flows so much more than the other that it's probably also going to make more torque. And that's kind of a test that I want to do at some time. But also, like we were talking about with the 265 big block airflow research head, it would also depend on what you're testing it on. If we were testing these on a stock motor where a stock small port head maybe has more than enough airflow, maybe the big port head isn't the way to go. And maybe the big port head, even though it flows more, the motor can't take advantage of it. Maybe it's not going to make more torque. And so when we ask that question, we shouldn't ask these things or even present these things as absolutes, because it depends. It's not an absolute thing. There's maybe there are instances where more often than not this is the case. I honestly don't know why on a stock application somebody might be considering a cylinder head upgrade before they would do other stuff. Maybe on a 5-liter Ford, maybe a guy already has a GT40 intake manifold on there. He's got the stock cam and he wants to get rid of the not so stellar E7TE head and put an Airflow Research 165 head or a Trick Flow Twisted Wedge head or something like that on there. And he wants to put that on there and keep the stock cam. Which the stock cam is actually, the stock 5-liter stick cam is a pretty good size and you can make decent power with it. I know guys will tell me you can make 400 with it, but I highly doubt that. I highly doubt that was an accurate test, but I would like to see if that is a test and if that's possible. But there might be instances where, more port volume might not be the way to go. I've run the Airflow Research 165 and 185 head, and I've always favored the 185 head on that. I've never seen an instance where the smaller head would be better. Now, right now, we're talking about, you'll notice, we're talking about, well, Richard, you're only talking about what stuff's happening on the dyno. What about the real world? Well, that's a valid question, because the question isn't like real world, like the dyno's not real world, because the stuff that happens on the dyno tracks exactly when you go to the track or you're driving on the street. What it does there, it still does out here. But the question becomes, what does it do at park throttle? And so if you're, just going through the throttle and not mashing it, going through the gears and bouncing it off the rev limiter and shifting, at the same spot every time and doing a drag race deal, what if you're just driving it around? The smaller port volume then at park throttle might actually come into play. It also might come into play for better fuel mileage. That's also a possibility. So then we have to start looking at, like, what's the big picture? And then we have to prioritize all this stuff. Well, is fuel mileage at the top of the list, or is peak torque or peak power, average torque or average power? What things are on those lists, and then which ones of those are at the top? So while everybody is running around arguing about which one, what's important, is peak torque important? Is average torque important? Is average horsepower important in the RPM range where we're shifting to run at the quarter mile? Or is, average torque 1,000 RPM before and after the peak more important? Is torque at 2,000 RPM important? What's important? And then the individual gets to decide that. Because again, there's no absolute there either. I can't tell you that, look, you should only run your thing from 3,000 to 6,000 or 6,500, because that's the easiest range for us to run on the dyno. That's not absolute by any means. It would be nice to be able to run it off idle to 12,000 RPM or wherever we want to run it to, but that's just not realistic. Sometimes we can't get all of that done. So again, it's important to ask the right question. But in this case, when we're talking about port volume, we're talking about the couple of times I have tested it, the bigger port volume seemed to do better, especially when, in addition to having bigger ports, we also had more airflow. So the airflow was commensurate with the change in size of the port. And so it went up. The 170 or 175 head on the Dart Pro 1, the ASCAS deal, the 210 head flowed way more than the 175 head did. So we're probably talking about 250 versus 300 plus for the 210 head. So it's a big jump in airflow. And you would expect, if you had a motor that could take advantage of that, a big jump in power. And we did see that on peak power. And we also saw that in a range where the big port made more torque, more peak torque. So let's see what you guys got going on today. Everybody's in the house. 1 Liter Mafia. Ricky's in the house. Cody Squirrel. More knowledge being freely given. What makes the Gen 2 LT1 so torquey? It has a fairly short intake runner, but small heads and small valves. I would argue that it's not really torquey. that a tune port motor certainly feels torquier than that. And Michael, you're right. The intake manifold has an awful lot to do with the torque curve of the motor. I would argue in most cases even more so than the head that we're talking about. In this case, we actually ran a single plane funnel web on this thing, but can I use 823 heads on a Gen 3 6-liter? Yes, and it actually works fairly well. I have a rec port versus a cathedral port on a 6-liter. It was an LY6, but it works the same on that motor. Smaller port with higher flow will usually make more power, more low-end torque. The shape dictates so much on the port. Do you think that that's true? Do you think, if you look at the shape change between a cathedral port and a rec port, and look at the flow rates of like a ported cathedral port and then a rec port, I don't know that shape really makes that much of a difference. I would agree that a rectangular port, especially with square edges, is not good because the corners of those are dead space, basically. That's why most people go to roval heads instead of a traditional, trying to make it an actual rectangle. I have a question. Would CNC ported LS3 heads be fine to use on a stock bottom end LS2? They will fit and they will go on. It's probably way more head than a stock bottom end LS2 could ever use. Because if you have a stock bottom end with a camshaft in it, the camshaft that you could fit stock piston to valve clearance is not going to be very big. It's going to be a 230 to 235-ish kind of intake camshaft. And so a ported set of LS3 heads is going to flow 350 to 370 or something. So you're just never going to be able to utilize all that's there, but it will work and it will run and make power. Dave, do you use different port size on a carbureted engine versus an injected engine? I think I don't. We've run the same on both of them. Richard, I finally got my 5.3. My car was going any more than I use different camshafts for carbureted and fuel injected motors. I think that's a myth too. Richard, got my 5.3. My car was going to go with an S475. I think a torque storm would be a whole lot easier and cleaner. What can I expect to see with a torque storm out of the box on a 5.3 with a 228 cam? I've always said that these torque storm superchargers were at least their original one, because they have an R version or something out that's supposed to be make more power. But every time I've tested these torque storms, they're always in the 700 to 750 horsepower range. When we've spun them, even with 3.1 pulleys in them, and that's where they kind of seem to be. Now the Morris has run them at higher levels than that, and I just haven't seen it. So that's what I tell people, is that's what kind of blower those are. Let's see here. Trying to scroll back, see what's going on. What do you think you'd have to compare to a port with equal flow? So you just want to change the port volume and have the bigger port flow the same as the smaller port? What brand of rods and pistons do you recommend on a budget LS? Well, if it's really a budget, I recommend the stock stuff. That's the best budget that you can get. And so I don't know what you're trying to do with it, but if it's any kind of NA motor, I actually wouldn't use anything but a factory piston and rod in it, because you're never going to hurt that. Not the power levels that you use with the stock bottom end. Otherwise, the Summit Pro LS stuff seems to be pretty good. I think a smaller port head makes peak torque much earlier. Well, peak torque happened 480, 480.6, 481, 92.1. When I ran the 799 heads and the LS3 heads on the cammed 6-liter, the two heads made peak torque within 100 RPM of each other. And then on the Ford, same thing. The peak torque on the smaller one was 5,100 and then 5,200 on the bigger head. So those were really close in RPM. The Legend. Is that like The Machine? I can't wait to see that movie. I love that. I love that story about being in Russia. I have a question about my Mustang. Order some cams. Just ask away. That's why we're here, man. If it's an under square, small displacement engine, small port is the way to go. So like an LS, where the bore is smaller, like a 5.3 LS, or a 6-liter would be a 4-inch bore, 3.780. That's still more bore than stroke, though, huh? Boost, Daniel, you're right. Boost does add torque. More responsive, better signal, no low RPM. I would agree with that. Like I said, especially at part throttle, I think that there's stuff to be said for the smaller port. And I also think if you have two ports, the one is bigger than the other, and they both flow the same. Like if we look at a good example of that is not only did I test on the LS, not only did I test the factory rec port head versus the factory cathedral port head, we then put a ported version. This was a trick flow, a 225 head. So it would be the equivalent of a CNC ported factory cathedral port head. And it flowed as much as the rec port head did, but it had a smaller port volume. But it also had a slightly smaller chamber too. So it had more compression. But it was basically better everywhere than the rec port head was. But I don't attribute that specifically to port volume, because I don't think that's what's going on. The rec port head has a lot of port volume relative to its flow. It's got an awful big intake valve. I think it has a few things that are going against it that made it not make the power that it should. Let's see. Wow, I'm trying to scroll back to get to where I was. Let's see. I got a 69 Camaro 307, is rated at 200 horsepower and 300 foot-pounds. No, that's not unusual at all, Joel, that the torque would be higher than horsepower. In fact, if you looked at most of the small blocks, except for the really high horsepower stuff, the torque would have been higher than the horsepower. And especially later on, and any of the milder combinations, like if you look at a tune port one, that was 245 horsepower and 345 foot-pounds. So it's a big skew. It makes a lot more torque because they were designed to do that. Did you test peanut ports against oval port heads? Yeah, I did. Is torque production limited by the turbo horsepower? Is like, say, 8-to-1 has an S480, does the torque at top? Justin, the torque is not limited like horsepower is on a turbo, because the turbo would be able to support a much higher boost level at a lower engine speed. And so what you happen is, if you just do the math, let's say that turbo can support 1200 horsepower. So do the calculations, horsepower equals torque times RPM, or 5252. Figure out what the torque is. You back calculate it. Figure out what the torque is at 6,000 RPM. Then figure out what the torque is at 5,000 and 4,000 and 3,000 RPM. And it's a lot down low. In your test, the 225 beat the rec port heads. At what engine displacement would rec port take over? I don't know. I don't know when that would happen. I don't know that it would ever happen on a stock. I think a trick flow 225 would always be better than a factory rec port head. I think it would take a ported rec port head to be better than that trick flow head. .53 LM7, Truck Norris, GT45, 14 pounds of boost. I honestly don't think you're going to get 14 pounds of boost from a GT45 on that combination, because I think you're going to run out of turbo before you get to 14 pounds. The GT45 is like a 700 to 800 horsepower turbo, so I think you're going to be able to make that much. Best Rorschach impression? Wow, that's old school. Welcome back, Cotter. Had an Arizona Arizona Speed and Marine. James, what's up? Burns is in the house. TPI runners that work better than stock, still running out of breath. How does a smaller port promote low end torque? Well, from cylinder filling, from air velocity. I'm building 4.8 liter L20 and planning on using a small Summit Stage 1 cam and about 8 to 10 pounds of boost with an intercooler valve springs, goals 500 horsepower. So that should be pretty easy, yeah. Stan told me you need 20% more volume for alcohol. Yeah, that's another thing is if you're when you're looking at port volume, and we didn't ever talk about that, but if you're displacing some of that air with something else like fuel, nitrous guys go through this also. If you're displacing some of that air with fuel and or nitrous, bigger port volumes can come into play. The shape of a short turn can change the performance of a port dramatically. Yes, porting ahead can make it better. There's no end to ignorance when it comes to goals, limits of horsepower, torque, and boost. I don't know about ignorance. Let's just say that it's a general lack of understanding or experience. Have you ever tested the Dorman 615 183? What is that? The fast clone. There's no fast clone made by Dorman. I can tell you that. That's a myth. I don't know what the 183 is. Not hip on the Dorman. What is it? 615 183? Yeah. Well, let me see which one that is. Oh, that's that truck intake manifold. So that's somebody that told you that that's a fast clone is way off base. I have one of those intakes and I have tested it and it made less power than a stock truck intake manifold. I do want to test it again just to verify that, but it will be nowhere near what a fast LSX RT is. The best Dorman manifold that I've tested is their LS2 style intake manifold, and it made power on par, almost identical power with the Trailblazer SS, but it's a lower profile intake manifold. That truck manifold did not do good. So do you not feel the carb signal is important where an injected engine can force feed the engine fuel? I do, Dave. I feel exactly that. But unfortunately for a lot of guys, that's exactly opposite of what they're saying about carburetors or carburetor cams. They're saying you can't run a tight LSA cam on fuel injection because the signal's bad. I'm like, well, that would be way more important on a carburetor than one on fuel injection because with fuel injection, I can make the thing idle. I can supply it the amount of fuel that it needs with port injection because it will do what I'm telling it to. With a carburetor, it's only doing what the engine is asking it to do. And so if you have a really lumpy cam with a tight LSA, it's much harder to get the carburetor to idle, I would think, than fuel injection. So that's why I think that people have this misconception about carburetor cams and fuel injected cams and why I don't really think that that's a thing. I brought LS swapping my E90. You said it would be good if it was an aluminum block. Is that because of the weight? Yeah, just the less weight. I have a 6-liter single turbo. Well, that will also work too. Yeah, the aluminum ones are. I've only ever found one, so I feel you about the aluminum motors. So when we're talking about a lot of these things, a lot of these comments would be just absolutes. So an aluminum one would be better than that. Actually, not if you're running a turbo, unless you get a 5.3 aluminum one, then that would be the ideal thing. But we don't live in an ideal world. If you have a 6-liter and you're going to turbocharge it and you're going to put it in a BMW, you are winning. Richard, was Chad using drag slicks when we did the TV show The Fastest Car? Yes. I would bet 75% of the guys here have no idea who Horseshack is. Is there an optimum range? Or Hotsy Totsy? Is there an optimal RPM range for turbos to kick in for daily driver or racing? Are they two different animals? No, there's not. The RPM range is the effective RPM range is going to be dictated by the size of the turbo relative to the power output and displacement of the motor you're testing it on. Please talk about sub 3,000 RPM torque for truck applications. LS6. An LS6 big block or an LS6 LS or neither one of those, by the way, are truck motors. Ever seen a torque storm run on a 4.3 V6? Yeah, I have that video up. I did that. That's my storm breaker video. That was my most popular video for a really long time. I just nearly finished a billet intake to mount a Hilborn fuel injector for a 140 Mercury. Nice. I like the guys out there doing the custom stuff. I was worried about hurting my Gen 3 with RPM, but never power. I'm money shifted to 3.2 to 3.4. Ooh, did you backhold it? You went from third to second? That's not good. Backholing is usually really bad for it. On my 500 smoke power, my jet boat, going from max wedge CNC Indy heads with single plane intake to standard port TFS 240 heads with Metalbark XT. The Holly data log shows 25 more foot-pounds at 4,500. Yeah, so you did an intake and a head upgrade, or a change, let's say. You think it's a stretch for me to know who Gabe Kaplan is? That's where John Travolta got his start. I'm dumping the peanut ports on my 454 Marine Chevy. Heads, cam, exhaust, etc. I don't want to go too big on heads with a stock block, 5,500 RPM. For a 454, my recommendation is always the Airflow Research 265 heads. If you're not going to do like ported peanut port heads work pretty well. And I still want to do something with Jones over there on the peanut port heads. So it seemed peak torque location would be more an issue. Cam timing. Yeah, cam and intake are going to dictate that, I think, more than the head does. I still love an iron Cleveland head. And now they have aluminum Cleveland heads. Man, we've got a lot of questions. I'm not even down to the bottom yet. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, depends on that. Do big port heads matter on a flow restricted intake? For example, do 250 CFM heads improve flow and engine with an old school 80s TPI? No, the head, if you restrict it somewhere else, the gain that you get from any single intake manifold, whether it's a cam or whatever it is, a big throttle body, set headers, if you're restricting it somewhere else, the gains will be much less. I wonder if Gail Banks has people telling him that his ideas won't work. One thing I know about Gail Banks is you cannot tell Gail Banks anything. He's a legend in this industry. What I'm not hearing is average flow through the RPM range. So far, we've discussed peak torque, RPM only, not the same. I know average flow for the head and peak torque or torque production are completely different discussions. So if you want to talk about average head flow, we can talk about that too. But we were talking about, the discussion was port volume and then torque production. That's what the discussion was. Now you're going into something else, which we can talk about that too, but that's just a different subject. Glad to hear the GLH did well in the dyno, except for the blown head gasket. Does Torque make a supercharger work with a factory Gen 1 small block Chevy serpentine setup? Yeah, but like a later one, I think that the blower, the way that they have the blower set up, it has it has its own blower drive. It has its own belt. It's not part of the other system. Average torque 350, 250. Were you not here when we were talking about people deciding the thing that they wanted versus the thing that they don't want? We talked about average torque production, average horsepower production, where you want the torque to be, where you want the horsepower to be. We went over all of that. Could modern camshaft and valve train technology make a difference, allowing big ports to work better? We had modern cams in both of these motors that I tested. Did the Porsche survive the chassis dyno? They didn't run the Porsche on the chassis dyno. I cured the wheel hub of my Silverado. Caltrax, nice. I'd like to review your comparison between the GM rec port heads to the AFR. What do you mean? I think I've showed the dyno curves on that. I think that video is up. On3 has a T680 96 built wheel, costs about $900 on my 412 cubic inch Ford street car. 5-speed, is there a better turbo you recommend? Can you explain the ratio? Wes, what I want to know is what kind of power are you trying to make? An 80 millimeter is actually a pretty good choice for a 412 inch motor. I'm assuming that it's making at least 500 horsepower or something, and that you want to make 1,000 plus horsepower with it. When it comes to tune port, ditch it and go Holley Stealth Ram, horsepower gains and practically no loss in torque. Well, let me see. There actually will be a loss in torque down low. And I know that because I've tested it. Small block Chevy, stroker. Zoom on down to our tune port shootout. Zoom on down to our final. Let's pick that one. And then we're going to pick the Stealth Ram. Holley Stealth Ram. So I'm comparing this was an extrude honed lower manifold and then a big tube runner and a stock plenum and then a big throttle body. And then comparing that to the Holley Stealth Ram. We can also compare the even I have a stock one here too, I think. We can look at the stock one. Final SLP, final stock TPI. So even if we do a stock, just a bone stock one versus a Stealth Ram, which in my opinion isn't a good comparison, but especially on the 383. But the stock tune port made more torque than the Holley Stealth Ram from 2,500 all the way up to 4,300 RPM. And then above that, the shorter runner Stealth Ram was better. But below that, the long runner tune port stuff is better. I like being able to go to data and talk about that. Random question, 6.1 headers or 6.4 headers for a 5.7 Hemi? I don't know what you mean. I don't know about a 6.4. Is the bolt pattern the same on those heads as it is on a 6.1? If that's your question. If you had to choose between 195, 210, or 210, 220 AFR heads for a dart block, all forged, 350. If that's a 350, I think I would pick 195 heads with a 230 cam in it. I don't know that I've tested their 210s versus their 195s, but a 195, like a CNC 195 eliminator head, flows more flow. I mean, it will support more power than you're ever going to make on that motor. The adding boost isn't going to change my head choice. Richard, which third gen Hemi intake manifold have you seen that makes the best power? I recently read that the Truck 5.7 beat the 6.4 car intake by. I don't know about the later ones, like a 6.4. I don't know about that. The ones that I've tested were the early 5.7 truck, the early 5.7. I call it the Magnum intake, the car one, the long runner car one, and then also the SRT8, which is the aluminum version on the 6.1. And I would pick the Magnum version of that. The truck one makes almost identical power, but it's just really ugly, and it has a recessed throttle body. Just have to make sure you have the right front accessory drive on the Hemi to use that car manifold. Yes, if you add 14.7 pounds of boost and you do everything right, it should double the power output of your motor. I'm scrolling back just for a second here. I think keeping the velocity of the air moving into the combustion chamber high is most important. To attain that slight supercharging effect due to kinetic energy. Well, you get a supercharging effect from reflected waves, which is not what you're talking about. What you're talking about is inertial ram. Actually, it's one of the 3 forms of charge filling associated with an intake manifold design. But also you can have airspeed that's dictated by the downward movement of the piston, which is a whole nother thing. So if carb injection has more power because it lowers the density and DI makes more power because it doesn't have to carry fuel in a stream, how is port injection low man on a totem pole? I still don't understand. I know why port injection makes less power than carburation does. I still don't understand in Brian's test why direct injection makes more power than port injection. And I don't know if it's because of the motor that he was testing it on is set up for direct injection. So meaning the chamber style and definitely the piston style. I don't know if that's the case, or I don't know if there's something else that I'm not understanding. I mean, the one thing that I do know about direct injection compared to port injection is port injection, anytime you're adding fuel to the airstream, you're getting rid of some of the potential airflow. So I know that his part of the thinking is that if we just have airflow going in there, it should flow more air. And if it flows more air and we just add the fuel in at the end and we're not displacing any of it, like we've talked about with the nitrous deal, when we add nitrous to something, the airflow goes down. When you're adding fuel to it, the airflow goes down. And so maybe by doing that, it's adding power. So, but it's not getting charge cooling. So that's how it could possibly be that the gains that we get from the charge cooling are greater than what we're getting. Like if we compare carburation versus port injection, the gain that we get from charge cooling is more so than the displaced, and it's offsetting the us displacing some of the fuel, because we're also displacing some of the airflow with port injection because it's going into the head. So it has the negative side, but without the positive side. And then with direct injection, we don't have that. So I hope that answers your question. I'm just thinking out loud. Richard, what do you think about Triton V10s? I want to test one. So every LS is a truck LS when you put a truck intake manifold. It's a truck LS if you have it in a truck, or if it came from a truck, or if you just want to call it a truck. Check out an LS powered 73 Toyota Celica. I think that's the one that they have on YouTube. Did it have the cross ram intake manifold on it? Because they had one at SEMA that had that Edelbrock cross ram on it. It was really cool looking. Daniel, a 248 252 is a on a 108 is a pretty healthy camshaft for a 355. So that's not something that I would put in for a daily driver. But if you're wanting to make lots of power and run the thing to 7,500 RPM or so, then it could make lots of power. Bob, back in the 85 to 95 era, computers had trouble. Yeah, I agree that the factory ECUs did, and particularly, they didn't want to respond to big changes that we were making. The mass air stuff was much more forgiving on the 5-liter than the speed density, which I thought was odd, but it was much more forgiving when we weren't able to go in and reprogram the factory computer. Once we got so that you could do that, I don't think that would be as much of a problem. I love aluminum motors, but from my experience, they run hot. So your experience with aluminum motors must be aftermarket aluminum motors, not factory ones. Supercharged, all Ford, 350, 230 cam, EFI, want maximum horsepower torque without going over 7,000 RPM. Okay. Richard, have you ever thought about doing a 215 Buick? I have not. I like that. I mean, I've seen a couple of them, but I've never done one. Is 3D printing a fast intake manifold possible? I don't know. I imagine anything is possible if you had the specs on it, but I don't know where you'd get that. Let's see. Man, this thing just scrolls down like there's nobody business. Have you ever put a torque star arm on a slant 6? No, but Dulcich has at West Tech. Let's see. Scrolling down. We run a 106.5 LSA and an LS7 with a fast manifold. I've won several Baja 1000s, proving you can run tight LSAs on EFI. Yeah, that's not a problem. The Truck Norris cam was a 107.5. So the LSA is not really the thing, which I'm going to talk about in the turbo motor, because in the turbo video. Tony, who is wrong about the supercharger? That's a power dyne, right? And I don't know who your statement is about, or even what your statement is about. Runner length matters more than port size. Power shifted backwards, locked up the Hoosiers. Oh, that's not good. Just saw in Marketplace an old jet boat with a warmed up 455 Olds for $1,300. That would almost be worth buying and just throw the boat away. Tom, the reason that the hard to get a big cam to idle low RPM with fuel injection is the overlap. The OT sensors can't tell the difference between burnt and unburnt fuel. But what if you're not running it in closed loop? Still laughing at the Gale Banks comment. I like Gale, but he is Gale. Can you tell me if this block is still usable? Why? What did you do to it? Did you break it? Tell us what's going on. Tell us the story. Lab racing. Use your words. Use your muggle words. I wasn't in on the slant 6 test with that was all Dulcich. He went through 3 or 4 different heads that he ported because it kept going through to water, I think. But they finally got together, and he did run a torque storm on it. I think it hurt itself though. Yeah, Lab, you need to tell us what's going on. What is going on? What is the engine? What is it? What happened to it? Give us a story, man. Gale's done more tuning research and development 1 year than most men have in an entire lifetime. I would say that that's true. He has done a lot, and he's done a lot of stuff that people don't even know about. Referring my post-modern cam technology to why some think that the small port, big torque idea came about. Burns, I know the interchangeability on the Hemi stuff. I actually wrote a book on that, not on the interchangeability, but I've tested lots of them. My question was, I don't know if the later Apache and Eagle heads, if the exhaust port bolt pattern is different on those heads than it is on the earlier heads. Can the VS Racing be modified to go into a 301 turbo Pontiac? Yes, you can put that turbo on there. It's going to be hard. There must be a reason racers sometimes epoxy intake ports. And you can, because sometimes they can epoxy the intake port and not hurt airflow. If you can make the port smaller and not change the airflow, that's probably good. Are you sure the shape of the port doesn't make much difference? I'm not saying that as an absolute. I'm just saying that if you take a rec port head and a cathedral port head and you dyno test them, the change that you're seeing is not because of the shape of the port. What is it that makes LS7 style lifter so prone to failure? I don't know. Let's see. Ford went to both port and direct injection, and so did Chevy on the ZR1. I think that they were trying to do it to clean the back of the valves, though. If it's got a crack at the bottom of the cylinder, I'd be worried that the crack is going to, keep going up. If it's just a chip and it's in an area that's not pressurized, obviously it's not the top of the bore, and you can file it so that it doesn't hurt the piston, it's probably not going to do anything. Was it the Gen 5 or Gen 4 Chevy big blocks that had peanut ports? Yes, it was actually both of those. I think it was. I know Gen 5, and I thought that the later Gen 4s also had peanut ports on them. But good ring gap 408 LS with an S480. 6.5 thousandths per inch of bore. A 224, 232 is a pretty good cam. It's not something I would put in a 4.8 or a 5.3 unless I was trying to make NA power with it. If I was going to do a turbo, I'd run a smaller camshaft. Small block Ford, 408, 11R heads, 205, EFI Sniper Stealth. Is that the sheet metal manifold? That's a small camshaft. I would put a dual plane on that. I'd put an RPM air gap on it. Casey, I like that I do cars, guys, that does the disassembly of stuff. Seems like a VS 7875 could spool in a bunch of different 300 cubic inch engines. Man, scrolling. Let's see. Okay, now I'm scrolling. I'm trying to get through some stuff here. Engine Masters aired an EFI versus carb test last week. The carb won by 45 horsepower because of air inlet temperature. What was the test on? I'll have to ask Brule about that one. Gen 5 big block had the 360 peanuts. Yeah, but earlier Gen 4 had the 236 peanuts, which I believe are a little bigger. I didn't know that there was a difference in peanut port size. You'll be happier with the 6-liter in an S480 than the L33. How is important is exhaust volume? Seems like a talk is more toward intake volume. I think it's exhaust port volume for me comes way down. It's way down the list. Tony, you're talking about Gale Banks and the Power Dyne? I ran the Power Dynes back in the day a lot. I have some videos, I think, up on it. Market Vortec Pro. That's who I want to do the deal with. We had talked about doing something. I need to get back with him. Laid out. You want you have a Gen 4 motor. Why wouldn't you just use the stock pistons if you're not going to use that? The Summit Pro LS stuff, JE, the Bullet stuff from CP is good. Wiseco. There's lots of good pistons out there for it. A set of small ports will make more torque at lower RPM. Did you just get here? Were you not here both for the earlier discussion and the dyno results? Any future plans for testing an L31? Yes. Does anyone have dyno numbers for a ported Vortec head with over 500 lift? I don't think a Vortec flows very well over 500 lift, even a ported one. Remember the torque plates for the big block forwards. They also had those for the Clevelands as well. A small world and watching the 6-liter turbo Big Bang rerun on Engine Masters. Look at that. I didn't even know it was on. Otherwise, I would have made sure my family was watching that so they could see how important I am as they yawn. Currently in Central America, running a project there. I've got a Snap-on representation. A few other brands here. I should be back in the States. Cool. Who makes your favorite standalone LS swap harness? I don't ever do swaps, so I don't know. Can lengthening intake runners and header tubes make it so you can get away with larger cross-section area and not lose low-end power? Yes, but making the tube bigger is also going to change the power curve somewhere else. It can. Actually, making the header tube bigger without changing the length can sometimes improve low-speed power. Have you ever tested Howard's Rattler cam? No, I don't know. And if you're giving me cam specs, don't give me the duration numbers at 50, not the advertised number. The 50 number tells me more about that. 275, 282 cam is not going to be very big, but it tells me more about it. Has anybody ever tested that marine intake manifold for the Vortec motors? I've never run one. Shadow Ops, he can make 383s out of both of those. Out of either one of those. Nathan, you got a 6-liter LQ4. You have roller rockers in it? Engine 7/8 headers, TBS intake, Terminator X. Does it have a cam in it? Because the cam is going to be the most important thing. Turbo 400, and then tire size and wheel size and all kinds of stuff. Otherwise, you didn't even. You should have just not told us what it was and asked us to guess about it. Greg Banish has a few awesome articles on standalone tuning or calibration. I want to disagree, but it makes too much sense. So you can port a Vortec head to flow 275. That I would think that would be a lot. Yeah, I wouldn't Shadow Ops. I wouldn't do a 383 with a 4-inch bore on an LS. You just do it with a 5.3 or a 4.8 block. I know the rod ratio is going to be wrong. Let's see. Have you ever used Banks torque tube headers on the Dyno? I haven't. What application does he have those for? On a turbo, how would you move the horsepower into a lower RPM? You just make the turbo smaller, or the motor, make the NA motor make more low speed power, and then make the turbo smaller. Jeff, I don't know about those Dart heads. I don't know anything about them. I've never tested them, or I don't think I've ever read up on them. Joker, 5.3 LS stock bottom end, looking to add the 220 cam, engine 7/8. And you're looking at AFR heads? AFR doesn't make a head for that bore size. You should look at a ported stock head. And actually with a 220 cam, I don't even know that I would waste my time on buying an aftermarket head for that. Jesse, so we got 2 more minutes. I'm going to close out our poll at 57% saying no. Does a smaller head part make more torque? 43% saying yes. Well, let's see. Somebody had can I run a 92 millimeter throttle body on a stock intake manifold, and what heads came on an 09 4.8 liter, and can they handle turbos without a cam upgrade? Yes, your 4.8 will take boost. Every 4.8 will. It doesn't matter what year it is. Yeah, running a 92 millimeter throttle body on a stock early truck intake manifold is a waste of time. Running one on a Trailblazer SS intake manifold where the opening in the manifold actually is 90 or 92 millimeters, then that makes sense. If the opening's not that big, don't put a big throttle body on it. If you're going to run a turbo on it anyway, don't worry about the throttle body size. That's not going to come into play. Just keep the stock throttle body on there. And unless you're if you're running your 4.8 with a stock cam, you don't need a bigger throttle body. You just need a stock one, because they use that same throttle body and intake manifold on a 5.3 and a 6.0 that make 100 more horsepower than yours does. On the LU 262 4.3 liter, there's a video of a Turbo Sierra using the MPFI intake manifold. It's a viable upgrade over the spider injection. I've never run the spider injection, and I wouldn't ever consider doing that either. Not with what we're running, not with the Holly, I don't think. And that's, I would be running it on the engine dyno anyway. That's why we always just put a dual plane carburetor on those. But it would be cool to be able to run port injection on there. Old double humps can be ported to 275. I've never seen numbers like that. For the L31, there should be. I wonder if you could convert like for an L31, putting the stealth ram on there, I think would be good. If you could convert the bolt pattern. I did always want to do like a sniper style manifold, a V6 sniper style manifold, because they don't really have any good manifolds. And on that note, yeah, for 4.8 stuff, I wouldn't be worried about throttle body size. That's way down the line. A 4.8, just, and especially if you have the stock cam, it's just going to be a 4.8, so it's going to be a 330 horsepower motor on the way that we tested on the engine dyno, and that would be with headers on it. So it's going to be, what's it going to make, 220 or something at the tire? Does anybody ever run a stock 4.8 on a chassis dyno? I don't think I ever have. Have you ever tested other people's porting and there was a loss of CFM due to bad port service? You mean, has anybody ever ported a set of heads and ruined them? I don't remember anybody doing that. Anytime that anybody's ever ported them, I thought that it improved the flow. Stock 4.8 runs 230 to 250 on the right day. That seems high to me for a 4.8. Is that with a manual trans or something? Who are the best companies to work on and port 4.6 PI heads? Well, that I've ever tested were done by the guys at Total Engine Airflow. I don't even know if they do more. And there might be other guys. The guys from Livernois probably have 4.6 modular PI ported heads. You can definitely overport if you modify the short runner on a Vortex. Yeah, I've seen that before. I've seen guys try to, especially on Vortex heads. I've seen guys ruin Vortex heads before. Have you ever done any tests on a 383 with a McFarlane intake? No, but we have tested the McFarlane intake because we have one at West Tech, and it's not. I want to run another test on it just so I have one on my channel because I don't have one. But they have tested it, and then it's not the equal of like an RPM air gap. Yeah, Burns. That seemed like it was high for a. I mean, I'm just comparing to the automatic stuff that I've seen. That would be more. I think that's more than my 5.3 makes. factory Pontiac V8 iron D ports can be taken to 310 CFM. Which casting number is that? You're not talking about their Ram Air 4 heads, right? I'm amazed every time I come here, there's not a million people in the flying chat, but I like it. It does get chaotic if we had like 500 or 600 people here, it would be out of control, I think. I have ported plenty D ports to 270. 270 is a lot less than 310. Nathan, if you shouldn't be making with that camshaft on a 347 and 195 heads, you should not be making peak power at 5,400 RPM. I have run that combination, and I probably have that video up. You probably have already looked at it, I would imagine, but I don't think that small block Ford stroker. Where's the trip flow test that we did on those? File test description. Does this have that camshaft in it? I think it does. Yeah, it's got 236, 248. This had CNC ported heads on it. I think we ran this with a dual plane also. Let's see. Test description. Yes, performer RPM, trick flow, as cast heads. This will give you an idea. Peak power is at 6,600 RPM. Peak torque happened at 446 or 4,700 with that camshaft and an RPM air gap. Yeah, that does seem low, Nathan. And what I would look at is timing. What is the timing that you're running? A lot of times guys on the street have to pull timing. And if you pull timing, it's going to make much more of a difference past the torque peak. James, yeah, we went over some upgrades or some updates on the projects on the GLH. Ran it on the chassis dyno, in fact, for the first time last night, and it did good until it blew a head gasket. And on that note, it's time to go. Thank you guys all for showing up. I'll be back in the morning.